Hello everybody, what is up? My name is Zero Solstice, and today I would like to take the time to talk about the information that has been gathered so far on the Scourge Necromancer Elite Specialization, and just kind of evaluate what is coming to the class. So, as a general disclaimer, everything is still in development. The X-Pack hasn't come out yet. It's got some test beta weekends upcoming, and in those times we will be able to try this stuff out with their current numbers, but the numbers will absolutely be up for interpretation, open for tweaking. Nothing's set in stone yet. So I'm going to try to look less at actual numbers. I'll use them as a baseline, and I'm invariably going to end up commenting on some of them, but the major focus is the actual effect or the utility. Like, what do we actually get from these new abilities and such out of this elite specialization? So, the major goal here that I'm trying to do is I just want to kind of look at where look at the direction we'll be heading in and what kind of our options are going to be forthcoming. So, without further ado, let's get right on into it. So, first up on the block, I want to talk about the profession mechanic. So, with the Scourge and with elite specializations in general, the major goal is to completely revitalize the way a class plays. And I would say that the nail is hit squarely on the head in this go around. So, what the Scourge does is you no longer have Shroud. It's gone. You can no longer press F1 and have a big fat life bar and 5 new weapon skills that do different. It's gone. What we have now instead is a system known as sand shades. And the way sand shades work are they are effectively ground targeted sentries that you can place up to 900 range. And when you place them, and I assume probably each second after that, if an enemy stands in it, they deal a small amount of damage and they apply torment and cripple. And they last for 25 seconds, and they recharge using an ammo system up to a max of 3 charges every 15 seconds. So uptime on these things is pretty easy to maintain, pretty consistent, but it's not so fast that you can just constantly shift them around the field, which I think is fine because that means that in terms of counterplay, fighting against a Scourge, the goal is to get them to overcommit to some zone of control and then force them to move out. So, as a base mechanic, I kind of like this. And Sand Shades, for all intents and purposes, really function quite like Mesmer clones, where whenever you use any of your other 4 profession abilities, F2 through F5, which are also new, and they effectively replace what used to be 5 weapon abilities. Whenever you use F2 through F5 abilities, not only do the abilities have an effect for you and around you, but also they affect around your sand shades. So that means that they kind of have this cool Mesmer clone kind of feel, but instead of being centered around opponents or a single opponent, it's centered more around micromanagement and your allies. And I think that's pretty cool because support isn't something that the Necromancer has ever really been able to do, especially not well. So it's cool to see that while this spec definitely just for face value has implications in damaging realms, especially condition based, it's cool to see that there are very well potentially options for making this into an interesting support or bunker spec and really open up a whole new build design space for the Necromancer. And I really like that. So there's not a ton to say about the Sand Shades in particular, but the other abilities have a lot going for them. So let's dive in. So the Scourge's F2 is called Nefarious Favor, and the way this ability works is you and your shades convert conditions from nearby allies into boons. This ability has a 5-second cooldown and no cast time. So, and currently, based on its numbers, it costs 1,382 life force, and it has a radius of 180, which matches the actual radius of your shades. So if a teammate sees the circle that your shade produces, just stand inside of it and they're good. So right off the bat, this ability is insane from a support standpoint. So what this does is not only is it condition cleanse that you can use instantly because no cast time on a very low spammable cooldown, especially considering how low the life force cost is. To put into perspective, 1,382 life force, that's basically one single staff mark if you're traded for soul marks out of soul reaping. This ability allows you to not just cleanse, but convert these conditions into boons. So there are a lot of really interesting things that this ability can do. As an example, if someone, say, converts stability on you or an ally into fear, let's say on you, because that's the more interesting implication. Let's say that you have stability and it gets converted into fear, and now you're feared. You can press F2 and cleanse that fear, because F2 has no cast time, so you can cast it through the fear, and it actually functions as a pseudo stun break, because if you cleanse fear, you're no longer feared, and therefore you're no longer CC'd by it. And you can do that for yourself, area around you, area around your shades, and that's nifty. But what's really interesting is how the implications that this has when you really stack or tightly configure your shades, because there is no cap for this skill specifically in terms of the conversion. So if you have yourself and all three shades standing within one another and you press F2, you're converting 8 conditions into boons on up to 5 people every 5 seconds, and it costs no more life force than a single staff mark. And that's bonkers to me, just on a core level. Just if it was when I first saw and heard about the skill and read the skill, I thought it was cleanse. The fact that it's conversion is insane. So we're talking like you can get tons of easy resistance out of this. You can get stability if you get feared. You can get a bunch of fury. You can get a bunch of might. Just all kinds of different wacky things just super regularly. Things with just a 5-second cooldown, this ability just has so much uptime. You can use it on just the little things, and that's especially what makes this ability so powerful. Because its cooldown is so low, you can honestly use it on just the little things. Do you have 7 stacks of vulnerability and 3 stacks of bleed on you? Use this. And the reason is because, especially for a lot of classes, like you can call out Necromancer just sitting in Scepter for this. Classes tend to have either long buildup in their conditions or a large downtime in their conditions. So by being able to use this ability regularly, like very regularly, you're able to make it so that whatever they've built up so far is gone. So long buildup times get completely wrecked on. But the fact that you can, in a pinch, put a shade on yourself and then press F2 and convert 4 of these things, that means that even classes like condition-based NG have a really hard time bursting you out, because condition-based NG only really hits you with a single set of blind, a couple bleed, burns, and confusion. That's about it. They've also got a little bit of immobilize and cripple, a little bit of weakness, and some poison. But when you consider that their major burst just comes from blowtorching you and static shotting you, and you can just instantly convert those, this ability is on a 5-second cooldown. Those abilities are on 12, 15-second cooldowns, 16-second cooldowns. So when you consider that level of uptime, it makes this one ability alone combined with the Sandshades almost kind of reads Condi's going to have a really hard time. If you control your shades properly in an area and you kind of stick to them, as long as you never really leave your zone of influence, I see it as being very hard to be killed by condition-based specs because of this ability. So the support aspect alone of this ability, just that almost immunity to conditions, this is very, very strong. So I can see this ability going very far. The F3 is very similar to Nefarious Favor. The F3 is called Sand Cascade, and Sand Cascade reads, Sand rises up near you and your shades to shield nearby allies. So it's effectively the same ability, but instead of converting conditions, it gives a barrier instead. And barrier is the new mechanic that they're adding into the game, which is effectively pseudo health. So on top of your actual HP, literally like visibly right above the number that you have for health, you'll have a second number that'll pop up for barrier, and it really is that simple. So this kind of ability makes Necromancer support a healer without actually healing, and that's cool because it means Necromancer's finally kind of able to have that space where they're able to support in a relatively average or regular way that people quantify as being support. Your ability to heal is something that people always say, oh, as a support, can you heal people well? So it gives Necromancer their kind of in to that spectrum of good versus bad support without actually healing, which is just something necromancy doesn't do per se. So I like that they kind of found a workaround that fits decently well into the game scope. Like, obviously it's new, we haven't gotten to touch it yet, so like as a concept it feels like it might be a little hard to digest at first, but I feel like it'll slot in pretty easily to the game as long as health meters and such can accommodate for the change. Like you normally have the red health meter, so now if they get like a small kind of opaque-ish yellow tacked onto that kind of denotes like, oh yeah, they have 75% health and then 5% barrier. Yeah, I can see this. I can see it pretty seamlessly entering the game and basically being pseudo healing. And what's really interesting is barrier itself, the max barrier that someone can have, scales based off of vitality, and the barrier that is applied by abilities scales based on healing power. So not only are necromancers now able to fill that kind of traditional support role where we have the ability to cleanse condies, we now have the ability to effectively heal people, but now Necromancer actually also has a good use for healing power as a stat. Healing power for Necromancer, not only because we never really healed other players, but also because most of our self-heals either had like okay modifiers or just no modifiers at all. I'm looking at you, Blood Magic. Healing power never really had a home, but by making it so that barrier can scale off of healing power, it opens up an entirely new design space that a necromancer can go into in terms of the stats that they choose on their armor and their weapons. And it, like, now if you want to play condition but still be support, you can run settlers if you want. That's weird and wacky and interesting. Like, the last time I remember even thinking about settlers' existence was back when people were screwing around with condition ranger, like Condi Trap Ranger, with Troll Ungent, because Troll Ungent scaled pretty well with healing power, and the Condi is all you really needed other than the healing power. And that's cool, right? Like, that's interesting. You can be supporty and still do damage. And that's kind of what Guild Wars combat has always been about. It's like everyone's able to do damage, but to be able to be a pseudo support in terms of like pseudo healing barrier and stuff like that, but still do damage, like, that's cool. That's a necromancer thing you can expect. Like, I really dig that. So we don't have the scaling numbers yet on how barrier goes upwards with vitality or how barrier application goes upward with healing power, but I'm hopeful. Like, that's interesting and I like it, and I'm going to try it, and I'm hoping for the best, because there could be some pretty cool implications for healing power in a necromancer if barrier is able to scale decently well. So next up we have the F4 skill, which is called Garish Pillar, and this is kind of like a harkening back to every other necromancer shroud variant, profession mechanic variant, where you have access to fear in some way. Garish Pillar is induce fear in enemies around you and your sandshades. And this next line of text is very important because it didn't exist in the other abilities, which is why they had crazy scaling and really interesting implications. But it does exist on this ability and in the next ability as well. And honestly, I was really hoping that it wouldn't exist on this ability for really stupid reasons, but I know why it does. But targets affected by this ability can only be affected once per cast. So what this means is if you do, say, a super stack of yourself and all of your sand shades in one single area, and you press F4 and you Garish pillar somebody, it's not going to fear them for 6 seconds when you have like 50% Condi duration. It's not going to happen. It'll only fear them for 1 second because it's only going to affect someone with a single proc. I was hoping that it would, because that would make for some really interesting revitalization for terror out of curses. If you could sort of like picture the implications in PvP, right? Let's say you're standing on a node and someone's trying to fight you and you're just kind of bunkering. You could put your shades down, stand there, press F4 and fear somebody for like 4 seconds, 5 seconds, and they're just walking clean off the node. They take 6,000 damage. Like, this would be... I was really hoping for that synergy. You can probably hear me smiling as I talk about it. I was hopeful, but there's obvious reasons why they didn't do that, because it's super hard to balance something that has that much variance in where it's bad and where it's good, or just where it's normally baseline and how high it could go. But I'm kind of a fan of making balancing in some ways where the foundation is okay and the sky is disgusting. And this would have been an example of where like on a baseline, oh sure, 1 second fear, 15-second cooldown, you got it. But the sky of, oh yeah, 6-second fear, 15-second cooldown, he's half dead. Yeah, like you can see why they did this, but as it stands, because target affected once per cast, the ability's fine. So on a 15-second cooldown, it's in the same territory as Doom, which is just Death Shroud 3, where Doom is longer range and single target. This is almost literally melee range, but AoE. Only 1 second fear, though, for being melee range, I honestly don't think is enough, at least not just in concept, because there's so many ways to screw with fear. You can cleanse it, you can stun break it, you can have resistance. Like, there are ways that you can just make fear do nothing, more so than any other kind of stun. You can have stability. Like, I feel like, especially since we're no longer a Reaper, fearing somebody no longer chills, so you don't CC them and then also gain that movement mitigation of them, that movement speed reduction. I feel like only 1 second for breaking melee range aggressors isn't quite enough. I feel like 1.25 seconds would be decent, maybe 1.5, because you have to think of the implications when you have Condi duration. If you have, say, 50% Condi duration, which isn't that hard to achieve at all, with just a moderate amount of Condi duration and food, that already becomes a 2.25 second fear if it's a 1.5 second base. Like, that is getting to the realm of a little too much. But as a base, 1 second, I'm not sure how I feel about it, but I'm sure it'll be fine. We'll give it a try. We'll see what happens. And for 4.6 thousand life force, 15-second cooldown, it could definitely be worse. In premise, the ability seems fun but not great. So we'll have to see where it goes. So the last major addition to the profession mechanic is the F5 Desert Shroud. Enter the Desert Shroud, gaining a powerful barrier and pulsing necrotic energy around you and your sandshades. And like the previous skill, there's the added addendum. Targets affected by this ability can only be affected once per pulse. So if you plus one or more shades are on a guy, it still only hits him with one pulse for reasonable balancing. Like, you can understand. So has a projected life force cost of 3.7k, moderate damage, a 4.6k barrier, 2 stacks of torment per pulse, and it pulses 7 times, once off the start and then once every second for 6 seconds. And it's on a 20-second cooldown. So this ability is reasonable. I like the fact that the life force costs for all of these abilities seem like the life force costs aren't astronomical or anything of that nature. So even if your vitality pool is kind of low, I can see you being able to afford all these abilities quite easily, if I'm honest. They might actually be too low if you want to consider spamability of, say, F2 and F3, but I like the fact that these abilities seem like if they're off cooldown and it's a good time to use it, you can more or less guarantee it'll be usable. But that's, again, everything here so far is speculation. Everything's up to change, and we're just going with what we have so far. But what I do like about this ability is it kind of fills in the gap that Garish Pillar has. So my complaint with Garish Pillar, again, was I don't like the fact that Garish Pillar, just as a baseline, 1 second of fear in a 180 radius of you and your shades. I don't like the fact that that doesn't really help you peel melee attackers very effectively whatsoever. But if you combine that with Desert Shroud, you're looking at 1 second of fear to try to get them off of you, and then if they continue their pursuit, you can basically give yourself a 4.6k heal, constant ticking damage, constant pulsing torment, cleanses blind repeatedly. Like it's a good way of de-incentivizing people to get on you, and it makes for like a decent 1-2 punch. But I don't really feel like you should have to use 2 abilities to do one job. Like that feels a little questionable, but we'll have to see how it goes. But in general, Desert Shroud seems reasonable. I kind of like what it does, and it can serve a dual purpose if you need it to. So now that we've taken a quick look at the profession skills, let's go ahead and take a glance at the weapon skills. So the Scourge gets Offhand Torch, so we only have 2 skills to look at. The first is the number 4, Harrowing Wave. Unleash a wave of corrupted fire, burning and tormenting enemies. So this is a half-second cast time, and it's a 20-second cooldown, and it deals a small chunk of power damage. It applies 3 stacks of roughly 4-second burning and 3 stacks of 3-second torment. So this ability seems fine. This is just about every offhand weapon that the game has, depending on whether it's like a damage or a utility weapon, whatever. Just about every offhand has a CC and a damage, or a CC and a major defensive ability. So being that this is more of a damaging weapon than a support weapon, I would say, Harrowing Wave is your bread and butter. You use this just for the damage. And baseline, it seems very respectable. So 3 stacks of burning, just under 4-second duration for an untouched 1,474 damage. That could scale very respectably. The torment on top of that is just bread and butter, but I mean, I can see with these numbers so far, I can see this definitely being a respectable weapon to replace Warhorn or even Focus in certain builds. And that's especially true because of the number 5 skill, Oppressive Collapse, which is corrupt the ground under your target. If they remain within the area, they will be knocked down. Grant might to allies near your target based on how many conditions they have. This is a 3/4 second cast time and 25-second cooldown. It does a little bit more damage than Harrowing Wave, but it's still just a whatever damage number. It really depends on how its scalar is, but we won't know things of that nature of any of these classes until we get to play them. But it has a decent initial number, so we can hope. You get 2 stacks of 8-second might per condition. It applies 3 stacks of 6-second torment, and it's a 2-second knockdown within a 240 radius. So this ability is really going to be dependent on how long it takes for that knockdown to actually be applied, because it's contingent on if they remain within the area, they will be knocked down. If this is a second or longer, it won't be terribly reliable, but the fact that there is a CC built into this weapon, on top of the fact that both abilities deal reasonable damage, means that this weapon can very well rival Warhorn in certain ways. Warhorn is great because it provides you really good utility in a dual swiftness cripple kiting mechanism, as well as some okay life force generation, but also that unblockable AoE daze. So the fact that this weapon is able to replace that CC, and instead of having the utility of Warhorn, it has just damage, means that this could very well be basically a better Focus in some ways. Focus has the benefit of generating a ton of life force and also stripping boons and just dealing really, really good power damage and having good scalers. But this looks like it could very well be the slightly more supporty, but Condi equivalent of the Focus. And I like that. I like the fact that it does something similar to the other weapons, but different enough to have its own identity, because that means that this weapon could easily find a place somewhere. Like, there are reasons to run this weapon. You run it because it has CC on top of damage. You run Warhorn because it has CC, unblockable CC and utility. Like, there's reasons to run these weapons. Focus you run because it's great at stripping boons, great at generating life force, big range. And Dagger because Condi transfer is strong and AoE boon corruption. Like, there's reasons to run all of the Necro offhands, and I really like the fact that this one has its own identity while still kind of competing with the others in terms of what it's able to do. Next up, we'll tackle each of the slotted skills. So this will be all the utilities, the heal, the elite. So first we have the new heal, Sand Flare. Grant nearby allies a barrier. Convert boons on nearby enemies into torment and cripple. It has a 3/4 second cast time and a 24-second cooldown. So just for face value, this heal is really, really good. So 3/4 second cast time, that's basically your soul is mine. So pretty hard to interrupt, easy enough to use when you want it. No, when you want to use it, like, cool. 24-second cooldown, very reasonable. It's not quite like a 20-second spam happy or even 16 seconds like you can see out of Your Soul Is Mine. But like at a baseline 24 seconds, not affected by traded cooldown reduction or anything, that's very respectable. That's solid. I like that. But the big thing is the actual numbers on this heal and what it does. So it says in English that it grants nearby allies a barrier, but the question is if that includes you. If that includes you, then that means that this is a 24-second cooldown heal baseline that technically heals you because of barrier for almost 9k with no healing power attached. That's crazy efficient. Now, naturally barrier goes down over time, so if you're not getting touched at the end of the day, it's still only a 4.5k heal, but if you consider using this in the middle of any fight that matters, almost a 9k heal, that rivals like an average to good consume conditions. Like that's super real. That's very respectable. But again, that's contingent on if barrier applies to you. If barrier doesn't apply to you, then this is basically Your Soul Is Mine with the added support benefit of also quote unquote healing allies around you for 4k, which even still on a 24-second cooldown, that's very reasonable. Like I can get behind this. This is a pretty sweet heal so far. But then you also take into consideration the fact that it applies 2 stacks of torment for 4 seconds and cripple for an unknown duration at the moment on enemies and converts a boon at the same time. Like this heal just does a lot, and I like that. Like not every necro heal is good. It's a lot of people would argue that the only really good heal for the majority of the game's lifespan was consume conditions. I'm a big fan of Your Soul Is Mine in proper builds, but not everyone is a fan. Although I would say that it's definitely catching on, at least over time. So at this point in time, you could say Necro has two good heals, one great heal, one good heal, and then a bunch of average to mediocre heals. This one looks like it could actually be a good to great heal. And I would say that that's contingent on whether the barrier also self-applies. If the barrier self-applies on top of the self-heal, this heal is great. Now, because we can't play with it yet, we don't know what the scalar on the self-heal is. So hopefully the scalar is good, because Scourge naturally wants to help you into the support role with vitality and healing power and such. So it would be conducive and synergistic and smart for the heal to have a good coefficient. It doesn't necessarily have to be one-to-one like consume conditions, but something better than Your Soul Is Mine would be appreciated. I'm pretty sure Your Soul Is Mine is like a 0.4, 0.5 coefficient. If it has somewhere in like a 0.8 ballpark, on top of the fact that the barrier will scale off that too, some percentage, this could be a really, really good heal. Like I'm on board, but I'm gonna need to try it. But at the moment, I'm a fan. I'm definitely a fan at the moment. Next up, we have the utilities, starting with Trail of Anguish. Leave a trail of sand as you travel. Grant swiftness to allies passing through it, and inflict torment on enemies, and corrupt a boon into cripple and torment. So, in case you haven't started picking up on this yet, corruption into cripple and torment is kind of the thing that Scourge does. Specifically, it'll take a boon and turn it into torment and cripple. And that's pretty nifty, because that means it lends itself towards not just kiting effectively, but also in their inability to really be able to catch up to you, they're taking more damage. So it's interesting in how it has this ebb and flow of you put torment on your opponent, which de-incentivizes them from moving, and you put cripple on them, which makes it worse for them to even move to begin with. So it almost creates this weird supporty kind of political game where you do this stuff to your opponent and they just decide, all right, I'm crippled for now, I have torment, let's just not even move. Like it's an option for me to just not even bother moving. But if they choose to not move, then you're gaining ground, or you're increasing the distance between you and them, and that's no bueno. You don't want a Necro to be able to free cast on you. That's super bad juju. So I kind of like that weird kind of mind game of like, you can keep chasing me really slowly, but you'll take more damage, and that's weird, but it's cool, and I like it. And there's some interesting. The other interesting thing to this is it's basically Spectral Walk. It has a 6-second duration, but it has a cooldown of 24 seconds, and it's also a stun break. So this is a really spammable kind of stun break. Like 24 seconds baseline for a stun break is really low. That rivals Traded Plague Signet and even like Bandit's Defense at a certain degree. So like if you trait this and it's a 20-second cooldown stun break, like that's crazy. That's a really spammable stun break, and that's pretty sweet, especially considering what it does. It gives you 6 seconds of quickness, 6 seconds of swiftness, an unknown currently damage number. It applies torment, it applies cripple, it converts boons. Like it has a lot of text. It looks really, really strong, and I'm kind of interested to see where it goes. But at the moment, I would run this. This would basically take the slot where I would currently run You Are All Weaklings. I would take this instead. Like, this is cool. I like this, and I'm interested to see where it goes. The second utility is Desiccate, and this is a 1-second cast time with a 20-second cooldown. Draw in vital energy from your foes to gain life force and grant boons to nearby allies. Convert a boon on affected enemies into, you probably guessed it, torment and cripple. So this ability also has an unknown damage number, unknown coefficient, whatever. It's 5 stacks of might for 8 seconds, which is a pretty good duration baseline. It'll scale well with boon duration. 2 stacks of Torment and Cripple. And then it also converts a boon into a condition. It hits up to 5 targets. Each target hit is 10% life force, and the radius is 300. So the radius, you might notice that, like, with your Reaper shouts, you had a good 600 range on these things. Like, they had a decent midline range, but Scourge really is based in, like, these small area AoE melee range style abilities between the sand shades and the radiuses of, like, all of this other stuff around your F2, F3, F4, F5. All of that stuff having a radius of basically 200. Desiccate having a radius of 300. It really is melee centric to you. Like, they're trying to make a lot of these utilities in that support. You're tanky, you're playing support, you have vitality and healing power and toughness and things like that, and you're able to just get into the face of your opponents. Especially, like, with the removal of Shroud alone, they're really trying to, it seems, to push you into that role. And I do like that, because that's what specializations should do. They should make certain concepts better. And not only is Necro support already, like, non-existent, so it opens up that design space, but by removing Shroud, it also incentivizes it. You can't, like, you need to play it like a support. You can't just guarantee taking high damage stuff or whatever and being able to get away with a lot of this stuff, because 300 radius when you're Berserker and Glassy or anything like that is not always going to go so well for you. So I like that push, but 10% life force per enemy hit with this. Granted, the radius is 300, so you'll probably hit an average of 2 people with a Desiccate, especially considering a 1-second cast time. Like, this ability is questionable. Some of it's not, it seems very high risk. It seems kind of high risk, high reward, because, like, its numbers seem good, like 50% life force potentially. That's huge, but, like, some Torment, Cripple, 1 boon conversion, some Might, and a 1-second cast time, like, it could be difficult. I'm not positive about this one, but it's yet another thing at the end of the day. Boon conversion, tons of life force, like more Torment, Cripple, and giving your allies might. Like, it has text, it does things. It's like, I'm not sure about this one, to be honest. I'll give it a try, but at the moment I'm probably backburnering it. The last utility is Sandswell. Plunge into the ground, creating a portal through Tyria for allied use. Grant allies using this passage a health barrier. Convert a boon on nearby enemies into Torment and Cripple. With a 3/4 second cast time and a 35-second cooldown. Necroportal! Let's go! This is really, really cool. So, it does like a small chunk of initial damage. It converts a boon into 2 stacks Torment and Cripple. We know this by now. This is just what these abilities do. It has a 180 radius. It lasts for 20 seconds. And it gives a 1.4k barrier when people use it. So, what? This is weird, dude. This is just so weird. Like, so my assumption is when you first place it, it deals the damage and it converts the boon. And then after that, it's purely just the portal. And if allies use a portal, they get a small barrier. What is this ability? It's so strange, but it's so cool. And I'm like trying to wrap my brain around it. And it's interesting. And I like it. I think it's cool. I'm going to try this, because doing trolley things with Mesmer Portal was already something I kind of like to do. So this isn't just better because, I mean, for how much I play Mesmer and how bad I am at it, it's good to be able to play my actual class and be able to do shenanigans. But, you know, like, Portal you can use when you're stunned. Like, you can place it when you're stunned, and you can use it while you're CC'd or whatever, just as long as you're on top of it. But it has a really long cooldown. But you can, like, place one end of it, and this is, how does this work? Like, the text doesn't really do it justice, because, like, do you place one end early, and then, like, how does it... I don't know. This thing's got me feeling some kind of way, but I'm excited to try it. But for the moment, I would say that it's mostly shenanigans and, like, world havoc to large scale funny business, but I don't know how, I really don't know how to feel about the skill, but I'm excited for it. Like, this is just, it's just interesting and nifty. And then finally we have the Elite, Ghastly Breach. This is a 3/4 second cast time and a 75-second cooldown. So this is pretty spammable for an Elite. Like, baseline 75, it'll drop down to just a minute if you're traded. Like, that's... I like this. So, breach into the realm of torment for a brief time, granting might to allies and slowing enemies. Convert a boon on enemies into torment and cripple each pulse. So, there are 5 pulses, interval of 1 second. So, it lasts for 4 seconds, and it pulses 5 times. Radius is 300, so moderate radius. Combo field dark. So this is cool because this means that Necro now has access to a moving field. I mean, granted, it's a dark field, and God knows how much people are sick of dark fields on Necromancer at this point. But, you know, it's a thing. It's cool. Whatever. Like, sure. They could have just not given us a combo field or anything. But each tick, you get 2 stacks of Torment, Cripple, 3 stacks of Might, Slow, and Burning. And when you consider the fact that the Torment and Cripple comes from boon conversion, the pulses, this is decent. This is pretty decent. You can honestly think of this to some degree as being the new Plague, in terms of how the old Plague turned you into, like, a floating, literally a floating Plague. Like, don't think of the defensive aspect, think of what it did. This is kind of similar. So, like, if you've ever used the racial ability Reaper of Grenth, it's very, very much like that, except just it does more. You've got your soft CC slow, your soft CC cripple, your damage and torment and burning, some might, boon conversion, and you're actually a combo field. Like, this does things, and it's cool, it's nifty. I think I like it. It does enough for me to be interested, and I'll give it a shot. But it's tough to say. So I would say that this is, I would say that, considering the field, like, if purely just in the field of Scourge, this is great. And the reason this is great is because you don't have Chill to the Bone. It's not even an option anymore. So this versus Plague Lands, you're better taking this, I would say. Plague Lands is fun and it has great down potential. Like, if you're 3v3 plus 3 plus versus 3 plus, like 5v5, so on and so forth. Plague Lands is good in those situations for downed corpse control and things of that nature, but this ability is just good all the time with a better baseline cooldown. And what are you competing with? Lich? Flesh Golem? No, there's no better option. So, like, when you consider the fact that Reaper's not in the equation, you just look at Scourge alone. I like this Elite. It's pretty good, and you can argue that it's just better than the opposition, but I'm not sure entirely how I feel about it in total. It does enough for me. I like what it does, and I'm definitely going to give it a try. But I'm not going to overhype it, because it might honestly just be a similar... It might just be a side grade to Plague Lands, where Plague Lands does more, but it stays in one spot, whereas this is more anemic and doesn't last as long, but it moves with you, so it's a bit more consistent. Like, I can't really say how good this will be, but just what's written on paper, Slow and Cripple together is already really punishing. If nothing else, in a 1v1 scenario, I can see this being quite powerful. So, and having a good 1v1 Elite on this class would be, like, it's appreciated. So, face value, I'll take this. I like it. Sure, works for me. So next up, we'll start tackling the traits, starting with the Adepts, we have Mantle of Sand. So this is just the Adept minor, and this is gain the power to craft sand shadows and command them using your life force, gain access to punishment and shades. Sure, you've just got your basic, this is Scourge. Cool. So for actual traits, we've got Abrasive Gift, Fell Beacon, and Nourishing Rot. Starting with Abrasive Gift, we've got granting an ally a barrier, removes conditions affecting them, and grants might. So again, the English is really important for a lot of this stuff because we haven't been able to actually play and test any of it yet. We're going to have to assume that when it says granting an ally a barrier, it also includes you in that. So for initial impressions, we'll assume that the class actually has synergy with itself, if you know what I mean. Like, stuff that says ally isn't just allies, it's also yourself, so that you don't take a whole bunch of garbage for everyone else. But at the same time, I could definitely see and understand if it truly is just allies, not including you, because that it's support. It doesn't always have to be selfish or self-centered. It can be actually for other people. Like, that is what supports do. They lend support to others to help them better do their job. So I'm going to attack all of these as if and hope that they do also affect you. So granting an ally a barrier removes condies affecting them and grants might. It's 2 stacks of might that last for 6 seconds, and it's 1 condition. This is pretty good, especially if you consider the ways that you have to self-apply barrier, the different sources from which that you can get barrier, and the other Condi cleanse that you already have on the class via, say, the F2 or dagger offhand or staff. Like, there are plenty of things you can do. So, like, just more Condi removal, but also ally Condi removal, and just like a touch of might. This is decent for an adept trait. I'll take it. Like, yeah, I'm not going to complain about this. This is pretty good. Next, we have Fell Beacon. Torch skills gain reduced recharge. Gain expertise based on your condition damage. So you gain expertise based on condition percentage of Condi damage. That's 7% currently, and it's a cooldown reduction of 20%. So this is just your average, all right, your new weapon, cooldown reduction, and a bonus. So what I do really appreciate is, unlike Reaper, this cooldown reduction trait is actually awesome. So expertise based on a percentage of Condi damage, 7% of your Condi damage becoming expertise. Like, that's a super easy free chunk. So when you consider the average Condi build is going to have 1,800 baseline Condi damage, that's 180 expertise. I want to say that equates to a free like 12 or 13% total Condi duration. Like, that's a chunk, dude. That's like a lot of free stats that you get, especially out of an adept trait. And then you also get the reduced cooldowns on torch skills. Like, I like this. This is a really strong adept trait, and it has that differentiation between your first trait was very supporty, and now this one's very self-centered and damage heavy, and I like that. So now we're going to look into the third trait, Nourishing Rot. Gain life force for every boon you remove or corrupt. It has a 3-second ICD, and it's 5% life force. This trait is completing the trifecta. You had your supporty, helps other people. You had your self-centered, very necro, original, like selfish, damage-oriented trait. And now you have your sustain trait, which is good for you to help. It's not just like damage or like raw utility. It's simply, it helps keep you alive and keep paying for your abilities and all that, especially with how spam happy some of them can be. I'm looking at the F2 especially. 3-second ICD is perfectly reasonable considering how easy it is to remove or corrupt boons. So the key here is it's not just corruption, it's also removal. So there's a whole ton of ways you can abuse this, even just through sigils on your weapons, superior sigil of nullification and such. Like, there are so many ways that you can make sure this procs almost off cooldown, and 5% life force, that's a lot of life force for free when you consider the grand scheme of things. For an adept trait, this is This is really cool. I like this a lot. This is basically like mini Blighter's Boon, but in a proper location to match, being not Grandmaster, it's Adept instead. I like this a lot. This Adept tree is really strong, and I like it. So moving into the master traits, we've got Desert Empowerment, which is manifesting sand shades grants a barrier to allies near it. So this is in line with the other support trait that we previously mentioned. So I like the fact that and they mentioned this in the live stream. I like the fact that the distinctive lines across the top, across the middle, across the bottom, these traits are synergistic across those lines. Like they do very much fall into one single paradigm. The top row is very supporty, as we're seeing so far. I really like that because it means that you've got options for mixing and matching, but you have your clear focus, your specialization, your specialized focus. And I'm really, really happy about that. That's the direction that I really hope they continue taking with the specializations. That's why they're called specializations. I like the fact that they're very centered on a concept and an idea, and they push it all the way through the trait line to the letter. As for the trait, really good. Manifesting a Sandshade grants a barrier to allies near it. There's no ICD on this because there's already cooldowns to Sandshades themselves in terms of the recharge mechanic where they have to take a 15-second cooldown timer to slowly build that quote-unquote ammunition back up. I like this trait a lot. So it's 2020 base barrier, affects 5 targets, and the radius is 300. So the radius is actually larger than the Sandshade, but I do believe that's because the greater Sandshade is 300 radius, so they just make it 300 radius all the time by the looks of it, so that whether you're small or big, it always matches. And that's good, that's smart, and that's the way it should be. You shouldn't make it so that it works well some of the time and then poorly other times. It should just work well all the time. So I like the fact that they account for that. That's cool, that's good design, and that's paying attention, so I dig that. But this is cool because, like I said, we're following through the concept of allies includes you. This means that this scales really well. You can use this, you can shoot this at teammates and give a bunch of teammates simultaneously, up to 5, simultaneously 2k barriers. You can shoot this at yourself and give yourself barriers. You can, like, it's great independently on your own because you can just shoot your Sandshades on yourself all the time and just constantly keep yourself barriered out. Or you can use it on yourself and allies, or even just allies. Like, I like the ambiguity of this trait. I like the fact that it's support oriented, and I like the synergy where now you have even more ways to be able to spam barriers out. Should you just shoot all of your shades out at once for barrier? No, of course not. But the ambiguity in the way the trait works, thank you for not putting an ICD on it. I like this. This is cool. And it has its role, and it does it. And as a master trait, it seems quite powerful. And we'll know more as we can figure out how barrier scales with healing power. But basically a 2k heal every time you manifest a Sandshade, that is not bad. I'll take it. Second, we have Sadistic Searing. So this follows through the damage-oriented and torch-oriented stuff. So this Sadistic Searing is punishment skills, gain reduced recharge, and cause your next manifest Sandshade to inflict burning on foes near it. So following in line with cooldown reduction of the torch and being damage-oriented, now we're cooldown reduction of the punishments. Or I think of them as hexes because I was expecting the class to get hexes, and these are basically hexes. They're called punishments though. But so now you have your cooldown reduction for torch and for punishments and more damage. So I kind of like how this has almost like a mantra effect where you use a hex and it's good for teammates, bad for opponents, but then you also have like this lingering magic that's even worse for opponents, and that's cool. So it's 1 stack, 4-second burning. Not bad. Like, that'll scale with Condi duration, so on and so forth. And it's cool. And it's AoE, too, because it's based on you manifesting a Sandshade. This one, however, is a radius of 180. So while I just kind of complimented Desert Empowerment for having 300 radius because I assume that's for the greater shade, This one's only 180, so I can only assume that this one isn't accounting for the greater Sandshade. So that's the oversight that I'm talking about, where I would kind of hope they would avoid that, but we'll have to see. Maybe that'll be fixed. Maybe that'll change. Maybe it changes dynamically. Although if that changed dynamically, I would assume Desert Empowerment would too. I don't know, but hopefully this functions well all the time, not just some of the time. Although, to be fair, one greater shade, you wouldn't necessarily want this synergy anyway, per se, because one greater shade versus 3 mini shades means you get way less burning uptime out of it. So, like, you can make that argument, sure, but it should function reasonably well all the time. I feel like having some kind of dynamic functionality where using greater shade causes 3 stacks instead of 1 stack of burning, and the radius of 300 instead of 180, like stuff like that. I would love to see that, but the odds of us seeing that, tough to say. We'll have to keep pushing. But for what it's worth, I like this. Again, no ICD, so you can pop a punishment, throw down a shade, pop a punishment, throw down a shade, pop a punishment, throw down a shade, and burn, burn, burn. And it's great. That's cool. And I like the fact that kind of transformationally, since you're playing more of the damage instead of the support role, you can transformationally start using your shades as like a mesmer shatter more so than a conduit for your support abilities or your Condy cleanse or anything like that. Like I like that transition of usage. Like that's cool. It gives you different ways of using the same class mechanic while still keeping specialized in this class mechanic, where now you have like this ability to kind of machine gun some extra damage at your opponent, but you don't have shroud anymore. And like just these little intricacies that come up, and like I really like these designs. So far, on paper, I'm really digging this stuff. So our third trait is Unending Corruption, and this follows through with the Boon Corruption and Sustain. So this is manifesting Sandshades corrupts boons on foes near it. So this converts 1 boon into conditions. It hits 5 enemies, and this again also only a radius of 180. We'll have to wait and see about the greater shade. But here, yet another way to use the Sandshades. Now you can shoot them at specific, like larger stacks of people for boon corruption instead of for burning, and that's a trade-off you can make. Do you even use punishments? If not, then you can take this one instead, because this one's just conversion happy rather than some burns here and there or none at all. So I like the multiplicit options that still continue to change the core mechanic. And I like the fact that because we're not actually using a shroud anymore, we're not focused into specific abilities 1 through 5, we can just constantly change like minor mechanics about how the Sandshades work. And that's really cool. Like, this is interesting. It can potentially be a nightmare in terms of like, you see a Scourge and now, I have to guess what he's doing. Is he Greater Shade? Is he Corruption Shades? Is he Hexes Shades? Like, there's so many different little variables in terms of how this class mechanic can be used. The possibilities, I'm gushing a little bit. This is exciting stuff, and I'm really interested in starting to mess around with a lot of it. And now finally we run into the Grandmasters. So first we have Sand Savant, and this is the Grandmaster I was referring to. You can summon only 1 shade at a time. This greater shade has reduced recharge. You affect more targets and influence a larger area with shade skills. So shade skills are the F2 through F5, and I don't know how to feel about this Grandmaster. So the radius increases 120, so as I was saying, 180 increases to 300, and you can see that this is in the same exact line as the other supporty traits, which is why the previous supporty trait for barriers had that 300 base. I still feel the other traits should accommodate this Grandmaster. It's a Grandmaster. It should have total synergy in the class, if you ask me. And the fact that just because you're not following the straight support line all the way through, that I don't personally feel that should mean that the other trait options get worse. If you were to pick this Grandmaster, but then pick the punishment hex, or the punishment trait, like, I feel like the burn should apply in a 300 radius. I'm just, it's got me feeling some kind of way. But the 33% reduced recharge. So the way that changes is we now you now have a 300 radius greater shade. You can only have one, but instead of recharging in 15 seconds and lasting for 25 seconds, it recharges in 10 seconds and lasts for 25 seconds. So it's a little bit easier to move this one larger boy around, and that means that this, like, I like how this. So when you look at this for face value, you can say that this is just worse in a lot of ways, because like, oh, now you can't just spread them all around and stuff like that, and you just get fewer of them. But the concept is you're in a full support line. You're helping other players. And this Grandmaster is perfect when you start getting into the large scale stuff or the really stack happy stuff like PvE or high-end World v World, where you can put down this one large shade and have your large stack of teammates constantly inside of it, running through it, what have you. You can put it in chokes. Like, the one shade in this specific situation that you can move more frequently to follow your larger stack, you can very well argue in that specific scenario of the game that does exist is better. And for that reason, I like this. Like, it gives you options not only in how to play the class, but also in where the class is good. And it's good that the class could be good 1v1, 3v3, 5v5, 10v10, 20v20, because you have trait options and the ability to move around utilities and such to be able to do things like this, where you have one larger shade that's really good for, say, a World v World stack. Like, you have one support Scourge in 4 different World v World parties, and now they're all able to affect their entire party, themselves and 4 people included. You're now sand savanting 20 people with like a bunch of Condi clans and like stuff like that. And I like that. It fills out the play style. It gives you options. I dig it. It's cool. Let's move on. Demonic lore. Torment you inflict deals increased damage and causes your foes to burn. Addendum, ICD. The trait can only inflict burning on a particular target once every 3 seconds. So this is a independent ICD, meaning it's a 3-second internal cooldown, but that's based on who you're hitting. So I can hit this guy, and this guy, and put torment on all of them, and they'll all start burning, but then they can't burn again for 3 more seconds, and the burning lasts baseline for 3 seconds. So baseline, no cleanse, whatever, no Condi duration, 100% burn up time as long as you're applying torment. That's pretty sweet. Damage increase on torment of 33%. This Grandmaster is super gross. So you have plenty of ways to apply torment. There are plenty of silly ways of also acquiring torment. I'm looking at you, Superior Sigil of Torment. You've been my homeboy for 3 years. I've been using you for cover condis and such. This trait's pretty sick. So the burning doesn't appear to be crazy. It's 3-second burning for 393 damage. But when you consider its uptime, the potential for AoE, like doing this to a bunch of people at the same time, and just making your torment better all the time, period, like, this is pretty sweet. And I like this. I think it might honestly even be a little too strong. Like, you look at how much text it has. It doesn't even it has almost no text. It literally just says, torment applies burns and does more damage. That's it. That's all it says. But 33% more damage, that's a lot of, that's a lot of damage. 100% baseline burning uptime. You know how burning scales. That's a lot of damage. Like, this Grandmaster just reads tons of damage. And and also this trait is literally deathly chill, but instead of chill is bleed, it's now torment is burn. So I mean, this if we've learned anything from deathly chill, it's the fact that you can't just let one condition create more conditions and expect it to be balanced. Because this can get out of hand really fast. Especially when you start finding other synergies, like other weird places to find a torment and such. Like, this can get questionable. But I like it. Like, torment to burning, that's a cool combination. Like, the original chill does damage for Deathly Chill was interesting and it was fun, but it wasn't like like it wasn't super special or anything to be like ooh about. But Torment adds burning, like that's just a cool combo. That's interesting, but these numbers might need tweaking. Maybe 20% damage increase. The burn is probably fine on its ICD or whatever, but we'll have to see. I like this, but I'm gonna have to keep an eye on it, because if we've learned anything, it's that this stuff can get out of hand. And finally, we have Feed from Corruption. And this one is super sweet. When you remove or corrupt a boon from an enemy, gain that boon. And the list, as you can see, is pretty large. It's got all the boons, but the big thing to take notice of is look at the durations of all of these boons. The average duration here is like 6 seconds. So if you were to run this with boon duration, you're looking at some insane amounts of potential boon uptime just for free. You all, like Necromancer, even just base Necromancer as a class already strips a lot of stuff. And that's the other key. Notice it says remove or corrupt a boon. So there's ways to abuse this really hard between focus, axe, corrupt boons, signets, sigils, just all kinds of wacky, weird ways to abuse this stuff. And to get so much free value, like 6 seconds of Fury, 10 seconds of 3 stacks of Might, 4-second Protection, 8-second Regen, 4-second Retail, 3-second Resistance, 2 stacks of Stability for 5 seconds, 8-second Swiftness, 6 seconds Vigor. This is insane! Like, what the... Dude, there's just so much here, even without boon duration. Like, you're telling me that if I take 1 stack, any amount of stab from you, I get 2 stacks for myself? My dude, this is crazy and weird, and I can already see the stupid things that'll happen when multiple Scourges, both running this, run into each other and just start having a corruption-happy extravaganza where they're like infinitely stab bouncing each other and like resist. Oh, this is just weird and cool and super strong, and I don't know about this thing. Like, this could go ballistic if you properly like spec into it and go deep on it. And Jesus, this is a really, really cool one, and I'm excited to just try it, but we'll have to wait and see. But that covers all of the traits. So now we'll move into final, like, tie everything together, final thought. All right, so we've made it through all of this for the last hour worth of me talking. If you're still somehow with me, this is where I'll start talking into some of my theory crafting. So if you've been paying attention so far, you've been reading all of this stuff along with me, then you've probably started to take notice of a few minor details. So the first thing you might have noticed, Ghastly Breach does turn you into a moving dark field, but that was the only mention in all of this stuff so far for this class that has any sort of combo whatsoever. Like, there wasn't a single mention of a finisher or other fields or anything anywhere else in this spec, and that kind of sucks. Necromancer has never had good finishers. The class literally has 3 blast finishers, and 2 of them are minions. So, I mean, the fact that this is a support spec and we still don't have good access to blasts or anything like that, honestly, that kind of sucks. That feels pretty bad. Like, if we want to be a true support, we don't have water fields, but it'd be nice if we could at least blast water fields reliably. Like, stuff like that would be nice. But, you know, it's just, I think if no actual finishers get added to this spec by the time it releases, I think it's safe to say from this point on, if anything else gets added to this class, it's just not in the cards for this class to ever actually have reliable finishers. Like, I think that is a design standpoint that they are taking at this point. It really does appear that way. We're just going to have to get used to it. Other things that are worth starting to think about. How are some of these other traits in this game going to affect this new profession mechanic. So if we're running Spite and we take Spiteful Spirit, how does that trigger? Does that trigger every time we press F1, F2, F3, F4, F5? Does it trigger once on a 10-second or 12-second ICD to match Axe 2? Or, sorry, Axe 3 on Holy Feast? Like, how is stuff like that going to work? For things that don't have ICDs, are they going to get ICDs? So if I'm running Curses and I use any of my abilities, Manifest Sandshade, Nefarious Favor, any of that, am I going to get Fury every time I use one of those abilities? Like, are they going to put an ICD on that trait so that, like a 7-second ICD on that trait, so that if I'm running Shroud, it still has the same exact uptime, but for the new Scourge stuff, it's not ridiculous? How is some of that going to work? There's a lot of wacky stuff. Soul Reaping, Foot in the Grave. If I press F1 through F5, am I just going to gain a stack of stab every single time? Like, there's a lot of stuff we're going to have to pay attention to, and some of those things we're going to have to see how they made them work or how they modify them for the beta weekend. But, I think some of those things are going to be broken on beta weekend, and I'm going to let you guys know that now. If you load into beta weekend and you feel like blowing some people up and never dying while doing it, then I'm probably going to recommend you run Soul Reaping, Spite, Scourge, and you run Foot in the Grave and Spiteful Spirit, and you spam your F abilities off cooldown and see how many Spiteful Spirit procs and how much infinite stability you get. Because if that stuff is oversighted and broken, then there's going to be problems. And, there have been problems of similar natures in the past. If you remember back to the original beta weekend for Heart of Thorns, back when Reaper Blighter's boon was every boon ever, so you could stand in the middle of a stack of Guardians, have them all use Empower, and you would full heal from 5k to 25k in 3 seconds. Stuff is going to be broken, and it's up to us to find that stuff and let them know about it so they can fix it. But it also means that for this beta weekend that's supposed to be fun for everybody, some people might find some of these things, abuse them, break them, and you might honestly not have a lot of fun. And that sucks. But, this is stuff to look out for. You need to keep open eyes for this kind of stuff and try to find these broken interactions. So I'm calling out right now, try some of these old Shroud interactions and see if and how they're broken. And we'll go from there. Other than that, this class has a lot of ambiguity. This specialization has a lot of ambiguity, I would say. It can very well easily be a full support because of the ability of Vitality and Healing Power to affect Barrier in different ways, as well as just a lot of the other random stuff that the class is able to do. It's very well impossible. You might just want to do things like Nomads, where you just stack Vitality, Toughness, Healing Power, and you build a crazy large life force pool purely for the ability to spam F2, spam F3, throw your shades at teammates, things like Barrier all over the place. That's the thing you could do, but you could very well also possibly be like a meta power Scourge, where you basically play the current version of Reaper, but instead of Reaper, you're Scourge, and you have all of these different synergies for stripping boons and things like that just give you, like, instead you don't have Blighter's boon anymore, but you don't need it, because every time you strip a boon, which is really, really easy with Axe Focus Power Necro, you gain 5% life force on a small ICD. Like, there's the power, and there's the support, and there's obviously the Condi option, and the ambiguity in how the Scourge abilities will change with that, because of being able to throw the Sandshades for damage, put them on yourself, spam your abilities for, like, there's so much possibility in this spec. And while I think some of the numbers are overtuned, some might be undertuned, some might look good on paper and be bad, some might look bad on paper and be good. I think my general consensus so far of this spec is that it's going to be really strong, and it has a ton of potential in terms of how its support aspect can actually be, how its Condi aspect can be, and even how its power can be. So I'm very interested. I'm very curious. And stat combos that have just never existed before to the Necro can suddenly start being a thing. You might see, like, Condi with Barrier synergy, like Settlers scourges with just Condi damage and healing power and just like the ability to make decent barrier spam and just kill you with torment. Like the possibilities are all there for really interesting and wacky stuff. And I'm super interested in a bunch of it. But again, I think some of these numbers for almost all of these specs, especially since I haven't seen large scale play yet, especially not for good players. Like, I'm not saying that the testers they have in house are bad, but sample size is very important in a scientific test because increase in the scale of sample size means that it more closely exacts to the actual outcome. So their in-house might be like, Scourge is okay. And then it comes to the public and you've got really good players and just a large amount of players playing it. And suddenly people realize, oh yeah, general consensus is Cloud's really good. So that's going to happen. Things are going to be overtuned, way too strong. And again, they have to sell this product. So I really hope in my heart that they don't mess around with power creep like they did with Heart of Thorns just to sell this stuff. Because if this game is borderline unplayable just from a sheer power level standpoint because everything's way too strong and you can't even play Reaper anymore because it's just not as good as Scourge, like, I don't want that. I want that to not happen so badly that I very well might buy this expansion pack, play all the Living World content, and then not even touch it after that. Because power creep is good for sales, and it makes people feel good when they're first learning all of this stuff. But if power creep lasts for more than a month, long-term player base or long-term gameplay suffers when you have things like power creep just lending to general imbalance in the game. And I really, really hope in my heart of hearts that doesn't happen. Although I'm not going to lie, my hopes are not very high. I expect there's probably going to be a stupid amount of power creep for at least a month in the game, if not more than that. Probably closer to 3 months, even longer. It took ages for Heart of Thorns to get toned down. And there's still some stuff in the game that's just silly. But, that's how it is. But I'm really interested in a lot of the smaller synergies. Things like Soul Reaping running Vital Persistence. How is that going to affect the Nefarious Favor cooldown, Sand Cascade cooldown, Garish Pillar cooldown, Desert Shroud cooldown? Like, there's a lot of stuff, a lot of synergies with all of the existing stuff that are going to have to be looked at with this class because the class mechanic has now changed so dynamically that we're really going to have to play around with a lot of this stuff and figure out what works, what doesn't, and what's just actually just broken. But these were my initial impressions. Make sure you let me know what you think if you sat through it all the way so far. I thank you. And I hope that, I hope you enjoyed. I hope that I didn't make this too difficult to sit through and whatnot. I hope my insights were useful to you. And with that, we've made it almost to an hour and 20 minutes. So thank you very much for watching. My name is Zero Solstice. And as always, have a wonderful day.